All right, you have a very impressive memory, Tanner. I mean, I know he kind of hit it out of the park with the Bible verse at the beginning, but then when he had my whole bio memorized, that's pretty impressive. So, so what I want to talk about today is the idea of disability in the gospel, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But sometimes I call this presentation Disability 101. What's in your worldview, and we'll get into that as well in terms of why I picked that title. So, I work for M&A Special Needs Ministries, and our purpose statement is making the gospel, the good news of the coming of the kingdom, accessible to all in word and deed. And so what we do in particular, you'll notice even disability isn't in our mission statement, because we really believe when you make the gospel accessible to people with disabilities, it ends up becoming more accessible to everyone as a result. And so that's what I hope you'll become convinced of by the time I finish this evening. We have a website, equalconcern.org, and that comes from 1 Corinthians 12:25b, where it talks about showing equal concern for each other. We often tell people we're not a disability rights organization, we're a bless all the body of Christ organization. So anyway, equalconcern.org is our website, and I also have a personal website on StephanieHubach.com if you want to see where I was speaking last year, because I've never updated it. Anyway, so that's how you can find my book or DVD series. So this picture of my family, that's my husband Fred, back in the corner there, and that's my older son Fred. There are a lot of Freds in the family. Freddy's actually like number 9, I think. So many Freds, so little time. And but anyway, that's my son Tim, my youngest son Tim with Down syndrome in the front, and this is Fred's wife Cecilia. They just got married last summer, so I'm blessed with a daughter-in-law now, which is just really super. So this picture of Freddie and Tim right before the wedding. Let's go back to the boys. Yeah. So I always have to tell a couple stories about my kids because I have a captive audience. So growing up, my kids growing up together was really a lot of fun. Freddie's on the academically gifted end of the spectrum, like most of you probably are, and then Tim had Down syndrome. So between the two of them, there's some interesting dynamics in terms of how they saw life together. They're just 2 years apart chronologically, So anyway, I was driving through the high school parking lot with Freddie one time before he had his license, and I was picking him up, and I said, hey, Fred, I hate to drive into the parking lot at high school. It's like, these kids drive like crazy. It said, you like take your life in your own hands to drive in here. He goes, Mom, they don't have a fully developed frontal cerebral cortex. so it's Freddie and then Tim. I said, Timmy's pretty high functioning. He got a Down syndrome, a lot like Allison's brother, Tommy. They're very good friends. And Tim was looking at one of my talks before I was going to speak at a women's Christmas event one time, and he's sitting down at the kitchen table, and he's flipping through my slides, looking at them, and he looks up at me and he goes, I think if you keep going down this path, you're going to lose them. so I told Tim, I said, tell you what, if I do, then I said, I'll let you review all my stuff before I do it. But anyway, I hope I don't lose you tonight. I'm sure I won't. You're a sharp crowd. So let's go on to the next slide. In terms of what's in your worldview, you guys have all seen the Capital One commercials, right? What's in your wallet, right? So my question to you tonight is what's in your worldview when it comes to the subject of disability? And all of us have, whether we realize it or not, have a worldview that affects how we look at everything, right? And so, and disability is one of those subjects where sometimes when we talk about worldview in a group of Christians, they're like, yeah, I've heard the worldview, I've heard the worldview talk, right? I've heard enough of the worldview talk. And, but I encourage you is that most people have not given a lot of thought to how their worldview affects the subject of disability and how they view people with disabilities. So that's what I'd like to challenge you with a little bit tonight. Most of us, I think, come to disability with a mishmash of perspective, and a lot of what I'm going to share with you tonight came out of my own struggle in terms of how did I process disability when my son Tim was born. I had a lot of good things that I can hang on to, I think, in terms of growing up with a strong sense of both the providence of God and the idea of the image of God. Those are big, strong things that helped me when Tim was born. But there were a lot of other things I felt like I didn't really have answers to in terms of understanding how do I even look at disability biblically, right? And how what's Tim's role going to be in the church, and a lot of other questions that came into my life at that time. So I'll probably tell you a few Timmy stories along the way. I'll start with this one here. You can go to the next slide. Thank you. I think the best way to kind of communicate to you about Tim in the short period of time I have is that Tim basically loves the Lord, he loves life, and he loves the Disney Channel. So most of you, we hate to admit it, probably know who Troy Bolton is, right? And high school musical. You say, high school? Yeah, we can all dance it together, it'll be fun. Anyway, but anyway, Tim came home. Tim, I don't know if this happens with Tommy sometimes, but sometimes there's a fine line between imagination and reality. Some of our friends have Down syndrome, even though I think he was. And so Tim it was very excited when he was in high school that he decided he was, not did he only want to be like Troy Bolton, he was going to be Troy Bolton. Okay, so he went into the athletic director's office when he was at the high school, and he walked up to the athletic director and he said, Tommy, I want to be on the basketball team. And so I got a phone call from the director's office one afternoon, and Timmy's on the phone. When I get phone calls from the high school, it was never a good thing. But this time, Timmy was on the phone, and he goes, Mom, he says, I have great news. And I said, what's that? He goes, I made the team. And I'm thinking, say what? So because he's 5'2" and weighs 170 pounds, never played a day of basketball in his life. So anyway, I said, that's great, Tim. Let me talk to Tommy, who's athletic director. And Tommy gets on the phone and goes, I talked to Tim and I agreed to make him the manager. And I thought, that's great. That's great. And I am sure that is not what Tim was thinking. so Tim got off the bus and he's still in cloud nine, right? He flutes off the bus, He's like, he's talking about the basketball team and Tommy. And I said, Tim, do you realize that Tommy told me that you had been offered the job of being the manager, which is it was a great fit for his gifts, right? He's very good at organization, he's a super encourager, he's a team player, it's all a really good fit. And he looks at me and goes, is that the same as the captain? And I said, not exactly. So that's when the tears started to come, and basically, and Tim ended up being a great manager, and he ended up actually playing in the last home game his senior year, and it was just really great. You can actually watch it on YouTube. But anyway, Tim looked at me through his tears and he said, when Tommy said I could be the manager, he said, frankly, I was shocked. But we're not that different than Tim, right? Because Tim was seeing life through the lens of the Disney Channel. And that caused him to see his circumstances, to see himself, and to see others inaccurately. And we do the same thing. When we see life through a lens that isn't a biblical lens of how to look at the world, we too can do the same thing. We can look at other people inaccurately, we can look at ourselves inaccurately, we can look at our circumstances inaccurately. So what I'd really like to just get you to think about a little bit tonight is simply, I think there's three general lenses that people tend to look through in terms of how they perceive disability. And the first one would be a modernist view of disability, the second would be a postmodern view of disability, and the third would be a biblical one. So what I want to do is lay those out for you a little bit. So the next slide might be Troy again. Okay, one more? There we go. So this is the part where everybody's going, oh, it's Friday night, I can't believe she has the ADA definition up there. But the Americans with Disabilities Act definition of disability is actually very helpful to frame how to just even understand what is disability. So bear with me, I know it's like late, and it's Friday, and you had lots of carbs like for dinner, and that Lupo soda, which is making me talk really fast. So anyway, so the definition, so basically, with respect to an individual, right, the term disability means a physical or mental impairment, right, that substantially limits one or more life major activities, right, a record of such an impairment or being regarded as having such an impairment. And so what you can see from that, from just the two highlighted phrases in there really, is that what the ADA is trying to communicate is that there are basically two aspects to disability. There's a functional aspect to disability, which is the impairment itself, right, the part of the body that doesn't work the way we expect it to. And then there's a social aspect to disability, which is that being regarded as, right, it's that idea of how the relational dimension of how we treat people and how we perceive people in terms of their disability. So if we go to the next slide, you can see that, as I said, functional aspect of disability is a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more life activities. The social part that is being regarded as having an impairment, and in that sense, the attitudes are what disable. Right? So there's the impairments disable functionally, but attitudes disable relationally. So impairments disable functionally, attitudes disable relationally. Okay, so hold on to those two thoughts because that actually completely ties in with the rest of the presentation. So here are the three views that I talked about. C.S. Lewis once said, good philosophy must exist if for no other reason than because bad philosophy needs to be answered. Good philosophy must exist if for no other reason than because bad philosophy needs to be answered. And at Thomas Born, I felt like I ran into a lot of bad philosophy. You know, and I would go to different, I would go to Down syndrome conferences, and I'll lead you a few of those in here. And I was in a lot of hospital settings, all sorts of different places where I was hearing a cacophony of voices on all sorts of different perspectives on disability, and it really caused me to really step back from it all and really start thinking about what does all this mean, and what does the Bible have to say about this, and what should the church's perspective be on this as well. So if we look at the modernist perspective of disability, maybe I said we'll do modernism, postmodernism, and biblical perspective. I think, you need the next slide, please. Thank you. Whoops, did I miss a slide? Can you back one? Should have one. Ooh, lost a slide in there somewhere. Okay, that's okay. All right? It's in there somewhere. It's lost in cyberspace. Anyway, I think if you think about the idea of modernism, you know, modernism really, in a nutshell, is a product of the Enlightenment and has been dominant in Western thought for centuries. And it really, as far as just putting it in a nutshell, in terms of modernist thought as it relates to disability, would be that human progress is both possible and inevitable. Okay, that we're on this human trajectory towards utopia, and that science is the key to that progress. So human progress is both possible and inevitable, and that science is the key to that progress. So when human disability is viewed through that lens, the lens is scientific, right, you end up with a modernist perspective that basically says disability is an abnormal part of life in an otherwise normal world. Disability is an abnormal part of life in an otherwise normal world. Now, as you can understand, if you just put yourself in somebody else's shoes for a minute, if you're a person with a disability, how would you feel about that perspective? How would you like being viewed as an aberration? Right? That means that my son Tim and Tommy, they're aberrations according to the scientific or the medical model of disability. Remember the ADA definition? We're talking about the functional aspect of disability impairment. The medical model of disability, the modernist model of disability, focuses almost exclusively on the impairment itself. Right? That's where all of the emphasis is on the impairment. What's wrong? How can we avoid it happening again? How can we fix it? So the whole emphasis is on fixing, eliminating, and perfecting. And this is unfortunately been the foundation for a lot of abuses against people with disabilities, and that's where this unit at. Oh, we have the wrong presentation up here. You know what? This is who's my friend with the tech thing? The one that's on the flash drive. Thank you. Thanks. This is the long version. We don't want the long version. Right? You could be here all night. I was merciful and cut about half the slides out. Sorry. Thanks. I sent a new one this morning. That was not animated. Okay, so anyway, Washington's looking that up. So basically, there we go. Huh? Nope. That's the one in the flash drive? Mm-hmm. Uh-oh. Okay. Well, that's okay. All right, stay with me. Just stay with me. So anyway, this is why I don't like technology. I'll lose my train of thought here. So anyways, disability has become then the foundation for abuses against people, the modernist views becoming the foundation for abuses against people with disabilities, because when the whole idea is on fixing, eliminating, perfecting, right, it then ended up becoming segregating, euthanizing, sterilizing, right, of people with disabilities throughout the 19th and the 20th centuries in particular. And one of the things, do you have a clicker? Let's keep going, see what else we got in here. No, we still don't, I can't believe all my slides are just gone. All right, that's all right. You can go back. So anyway, go back one more. There you go. All right, so the whole idea in terms of eugenics, which you're all familiar with what eugenics is, and eugenics, the term eugenics essentially means good genes, right? It's the whole idea of getting rid of the undesirables by multiplying the desirables. And it was actually Francis Galton, Charles Darwin's cousin, that actually coined the phrase eugenics, and I thought it'd be kind of interesting to have been around their dinner table because their perspectives definitely correlate to each other. But eugenics is essentially just a byproduct of a modernist worldview, right? And so basically, then you look at things like institution and sterilization of the intellectually and physically disabled, and it was just really part of that whole frame of thought in terms of how do we get rid of the undesirables by multiplying the desirables. And so, and I'm sure you're familiar with this as well, that eugenics did not start in Nazi Germany. It just went to its logical conclusion in Nazi Germany in terms of taking the philosophy of eugenics and taking it to the nth degree. But it was actually started in the United States. It was really funded by several wealthy American families. So we're still living with the byproducts of eugenics today too, because even though we don't have the institutions like you see in the background, and when you look at a picture of an institution of that size, don't just think of it in terms of the building. Think about how many lives that represented. I mean, millions of people over the years that lived in these institutions, and they weren't just in town where mom and dad could go visit. And these were usually in really remote areas because the whole idea was to have a separation from the rest of society. And so, as I said, we may not have large institutions like this today, and we've made a lot of progress in terms of disability in our culture, but we do still have this underlying eugenic idea in terms of getting rid of the undesirables, which is why we have such a high abortion rate of children with Down syndrome. And so different means, right? Like it's still the same purpose and the same end. And so just abortion's being used today to achieve that end. So different means, same root cause. And it all comes from a perspective of seeing disability as an abnormal part of life in an otherwise normal world. Okay, you can go to the next slide, next one. Okay, and so what happened if modernism looked at the world as being on this trajectory towards utopia, right, and that science was the way to get there? Postmodernism is an understandable reaction to modernism then, right? Because you look at the 20th century and you say, okay, World War I, World War II, atomic bomb, Nazi Germany, this does not look like a trajectory towards utopia, right? And so that's where the seeds for postmodernism were essentially planted, was in a response, a reaction to saying, this is not working. This is not working well. And so postmodernism essentially is, as Douglas Groothuis says in Truth Decay, postmodernism is in many ways modernism gone to seed, carried to its logical conclusion and inevitable demise. So it rejects the myth of inevitable human progress, and it rejects the idea that science is the key to that progress. So when you look at, next slide please. Ta-da! Okay, good. So when you look at the whole idea of what's a postmodern perspective of disability, well, the modern perspective of disability almost exclusively focused on the functional aspect, the impairment itself, how do we fix, eliminate, perfect, right? The postmodern response to that has been really an attempt, and in postmodern fashion, right, to reframe the debate by the changing of language, right, the changing of power structure, lots of things that happen in a postmodern alignment of things. And so when you look at postmodern view of disability, it really attempts to reframe the debate and says that people are primarily disabled because of how others perceive them and our unwillingness to make accommodations, right? So fixing, eliminating, perfecting aren't even appropriate. It's not even appropriate to in some people's views, even to treat disability, okay, because it's natural, right? That's how it's being framed. And what I would say is the postmodern perspective on disability is a very understandable reaction to the modern view, because people, especially disability advocates or people who have disabilities, have looked at the abuses against people with disabilities throughout the centuries and said, I don't want to be an abnormal part of life in an otherwise normal world, and I don't want to be treated this way, right? So you get the swing of the pendulum or the seesaw, right? And tipping of the seesaw in the other direction. And so the postmodern view almost exclusively focuses on the social dimensions of disability. And I heard this quote at a Down syndrome conference one time. It said, having a disability is a difference like any other human characteristic. It is by no means a tragedy. It does not deserve pity or benevolence or charity. Now's the time to recognize and celebrate disability. Do you hear the shift? I mean, there's a huge shift from institutionalization, sterilization, euthanization, right, over to celebrating disability, right? And you can see how language is actually used to do that in terms of changing that balance. And so from a postmodern perspective, disability is really considered to be a normal part of life in a normal world, right? Disability is a normal part of life in a normal world. So it's simply a difference no different than hair color, right? And that it's a difference that has no negative import associated with it, other than what we socially attach to it, okay? And now here's where the problem is with that perspective, is I don't think it's completely honest, right? Because it's only really part of the story, and one of the things it does too is that it alters our response, and I think it alters it in a negative way. So, have people with disabilities been treated poorly? Absolutely, right? And should we be upset about that? Absolutely, right? I'm not disagreeing with that. But what I'm saying is, yes, all along we ought to have celebrated the person, right? And shame on us for not doing that. But should we celebrate the disability itself, right? Is acquiring the disability itself celebratory? And if it is, why don't we all run out and try to get traumatic brain injuries, right? I mean, that is the logical conclusion of that. And so I don't think that, I don't think that's where they're trying to get you to go, but that is the logical conclusion to that perspective. And what it does is it delegitimizes some of the difficulty that comes with disability, and it delegitimizes some of the grief issues that happen for families affected by disability as well. And here's where I think it alters your response in a negative way. If disability is a normal part of life in a normal world, it's no different than hair color. Difference no different than hair color, right? Then it really does not require anything of you and me. You are off the hook. You're done. Go home. Right? I mean, that's essentially what's true. And again, I don't think that was the intent of the advocacy movement in the postmodern context to achieve that end, but in reality, again, that is the logical conclusion of that approach. If disability is just a normal part of life in the normal world, so what? Right? So what? So, let's go to the next slide. So which is it? Is it a functional view of disability, like the medical model promotes, or the modernist view? Or is disability primarily a social challenge? And what I would say is I think the important thing to do is to try to affirm what's true in each perspective, right? And then where do we need to bring the gospel to bear on both of these perspectives. So it's true, I think what we can affirm about the modernist perspective is that disability does involve real functional impairment. It often involves real and relentless difficulties. I think we can give a couple of points to the postmodern side of the chart by saying disability that usually cannot be fixed. And it does occur across all cultures. It knows no socioeconomic boundaries. It does occur with unpredictable regularity. And it is exacerbated by people's biases, okay? But what do we have to disagree with? I think, here's the next slide. I think what we have to disagree with, and this is where I want to frame the biblical perspective, which I think masterfully brings together actually the strengths of both the modernist and postmodern view, is that we live in a God-centered universe, not a naturalistic one, okay? And the underlying idea behind both modernism and postmodernism is a naturalistic universe, that all there is what you can see, and what you see can be fixed, right? Or does not need to be fixed, just your attitude needs to be fixed, right? And so, but what the scriptures teach is that we live in a God-centered universe, not just a naturalistic one. So there is a God who is high and above all other things that are just what we see in nature, including disability. So there's this grand story of creation, fall, redemption, consummation, right, that goes from the beginning of time to the end of eternity. And so this grand story of creation, fall, redemption, and consummation, though, is a very different story than a trajectory towards utopia. Okay, what the scriptures teach is not a trajectory towards utopia. It's a crash and burn, right? And then a hard road of the coming of the kingdom, right? That until Christ comes again and consummates his kingdom in its final stages, we don't experience wholeness, and we are not on a nice, beautiful, scientific linear path. Okay, and the other, but what I do think. Also, that the biblical view, like I said, is it really takes into account both the functional and the social aspects. If we go to the next slide, Francis Schaeffer says, if one begins to consider the differences between Christianity and rationalistic philosophy's answers, one must begin by understanding that man and history are now abnormal. So in other words, I think that the biblical perspective of disability is that disability is a normal part of life in an abnormal world, where the world itself is not as it was originally intended to be, as it was created, right? None of us are as we were originally intended to be. Nothing in creation is as it was originally intended to be. And so when we recognize that, you say, well, then that means disability is a normal part of life, something we should expect. That's what I mean by the normal part of life. Disability shouldn't surprise us. We shouldn't be shocked. And that's one of the things that happens often. I think we're just shocked when we encounter disability at times. And yet, I think if we look at the overarching story of the scripture, we see, well, this is just a normal part of life in an abnormal world, where nothing is as it was originally intended or created to be. So disability really, go to the next slide, please. Disability, like every other form of brokenness and difficulty in this life, is just a byproduct of the fall. So, and as a result, then disability then makes complete sense from both the functional and the social perspective. The functional perspective is a part of the body that doesn't work the way we expect it to, because there's a brokenness in creation, right, in terms of how a person's body functions. That doesn't mean your body functions. I'm not saying that you've got 100% perfect little good going. That's not my point, because you don't. The more we learn about the human genome, the more we find we're all ticking time bombs of fractured creation on a certain level in terms of potential for different things to go wrong with our bodies. But then we have the functional aspect. And then we also have the relational aspect is also a function of the fall, because it really comes from our broken hearts, right? Our hearts that don't work as they were originally designed to work. So they become self-centered, me-centered, not other-centered in terms of how we care for others. And so, yes, people have real limitations and real impairments, and yes, people also have real attitudes and real behaviors that oppress others even further, and whether that oppression happens passively or actively. And I would say that passive injustice is more what you tend to see within the church, and more than active injustice. So active injustice would be the holding down of another through use of power that's immoral or inequitable. But passive injustice is often simply happens through what is not done, right? It's more an injustice of neglect. Okay, and so when I'm working with churches, often it's really raising awareness and getting people off of dead center, right, in order to recognize passive injustice where it's occurring. So here's Tana mentioned that my background's in economics, so I tend to dissolve into graphs at times, so I can't help myself. So anyway, I won't make you do any calculus for this, so that's good. So anyway, so sometimes one of the ways I tend to think about, I think this helps people a little bit. I think if you think about the reality that every one of us is a mixture of the blessing of creation and the brokenness of the fall in every aspect of our personhood. And I think sometimes we forget that. I think sometimes we okay, I understand that my soul, my sinful soul is fractured, right? But the rest of me is cooking with gas, right? And you're just like, well, actually, it's a little more complicated than that. In Romans 8, I think, is where Paul talks about the groaning of creation, right? He's talking about the groaning of creation under the effects of the fall, and it affects every aspect of personhood for every individual and every aspect of creation. It's universal and pervasive. And so when you think about the whole idea of capacity and brokenness, right? If you think about in theory, prior to the fall, all of us would have had 100% capacity in every area of our personhood: the intellectual, the psychological, emotional, social, spiritual, right? And yet, because of the fall, every one of us is a mixture of brokenness and capacity, right? In every area of our being. And you look at that bar, you know where your strengths and your weaknesses are. You know you got a bar that's running pretty far to the right. You know you got a bar that's running a lot closer to the left. And so if you think about disability, is just a more noticeable form of the brokenness that's common to the human experience. Do you see how that changes everything? Right? Instead of it being something that's other, right? It's an aberration, it's something other, it's something to be fixed, eliminated, perfected. It's more of a difference of degree, right? It's a more noticeable form of brokenness that is common to the human experience. So next slide. So if you think about it, then what does that really have to do with the gospel? Okay, here's where the wrap-up is. God is in the business of taking whatever is difficult, right, or whatever is broken, and redeeming it for his glory. He's in the business of taking whatever is difficult or broken and redeeming it for his glory. Let's go to the next slide, please. When Jesus was talking to the disciples in John chapter 9, do you remember that part where he's walking down the road with the disciples? And if you sit down and read the whole thing, read the whole chapter, because it's really just an amazing story. And the disciples are standing there, you can almost hear them sounding sort of puffed up, like, so, who sinned, this man or his parents, right? We know it's one or the other. And I guess a lot of times Jesus just turns around and he says, it's neither. He said, this happened that the work of God might be displayed in his life, right? And so what I want you to remember is that is God's story for every one of us. If disability is a difference of degree of the brokenness that's common to the human experience, and God's in the business of redeeming and restoring that which is broken, right? Then what's his purpose for you too? Whether you have a diagnosable disability or not, right? It's that the work of God might be displayed in your life. And that is the same purpose that God has for a person with a visible disability as well. Gerhardus Voss, Dutch theologian, once said, Jesus' method of teaching was not the philosophical one of defining a thing, but the popular parabolic one of describing and illustrating it. And that's what I think disability ministry does for the local church. I think it becomes a three-dimensional picture of the gospel when you have people with disabilities that are active and involved participants in your congregation. Because here's why. If we don't recognize that it was our profound spiritual disability, up to the point of what Paul says being dead in our trespasses, right? A profound spiritual disability that caused Christ to come and make access to the Father on our behalf. If we don't understand that, then we don't understand the gospel. But if we do understand that, then how does that put into perspective the kind of accommodations I need to make so a child with Down syndrome can understand the Sunday school lesson, right? Or so a kid with autism can come to a youth group event, right? Or pick any of the myriad of possibilities, right, in terms of all different kinds of human difference in terms of disability. But what's required of me in order to make accommodations for that person is so relatively minor, right, compared to what Jesus did to make access from my only disabled spiritual condition, that it puts it all into perspective, and it's a constant reminder. It's a constant reminder of who I am, right? That I'm not the whole person taking care of the broken person, right? When I'm assisting somebody with disability, I'm a broken person who's brokenness may not be as noticeable from the outside, right? But is significant on the inside. And that changes everything about the dynamic in the relationship in terms of it being a respect-oriented relationship. The other thing I think, too, is to remember when Jesus was talking to the Pharisees in Matthew 23:23, it's that whole section where he's having that dialogue with them. It's kind of, I think it might be the section with the vipers, that part. He's going around with the Pharisees and they're really kind of bantering back and forth, and he's really kind of letting them have it. And in this one particular passage, he says, you tithe a tenth of your mint and dill and cumin, but you neglect the greater matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. And I think we can do the same thing when it comes to making accommodations for our friends who might have noticeable disabilities. Is we can say, okay, I hear you, I hear how much access Jesus made for me, right? What I have to do. How much I have to do to make it up, right? But that's, I always tell people, I'll take that over nothing, but I really don't want that. What I really want people to say is how can I love someone else like Jesus loved me? In justice, right? In mercy. In justice being right, that doing using the appropriate use of power to do what's right and fair. Right? Mercy, a voluntary sorrow which joins itself to the suffering of another. And faithfulness, which is walking alongside of somebody for the duration. And that's exactly what Jesus has done for me. Justice, mercy, faithfulness. How can I love like Jesus has loved me? In other words, how can I be motivated by love and not by the law? Right? The law says what must I do? But the love of Christ and the love in the gospel says, how can I love as I've been loved? So what I would like you to do is just watch a little video with me. I'll give you a little background. And then I'll be glad to take your questions. I'll be glad to give you some ideas of where I think disability might, cross into your life. You may not feel like it does very much here at Yale. But I think the perspective that you'll get from this clip will help you in your life here at Yale more than you think. Quick thought. This is a story about a father-son team called Team Hoyt. Have you guys ever heard of these guys? So, this is a dad who is like a couch potato, okay? And so you're like, okay. Anyway, so and his son was cerebral palsy, who is in maybe his 40s. So the dad was maybe 60, okay? And so his son wanted to, and the son has significant cerebral palsy, right? So he's the guy at the beginning. That's his eye, okay? So anyway, and the reason it's his eye is because that's how he communicates, is through a computer where he is able to type with his eyes, okay? So that's a level of disability. Now he wanted to do an Ironman competition. The son of the disability. So his dad agreed to get in shape so that he could do an Ironman competition with his son. So that's the background story. And some of these are old family videos that this starts out with, so it looks kind of grainy, and you're thinking, so what? Where does this bad? I'm so making no sense to me, but stay with it. You'll catch it. And here's the thing I want you to do. I want you to switch gears somewhere along the line here. Right? So I want you to watch part of the video thinking, that you're the dad, okay, who's pushing the chair, and think of somebody in your life who you know who has a diagnosable disability, okay? Then at some point, I want you to switch, and I want you to become the person in the chair, okay? And that's Jesus pushing you. All right, so I want you to try to do both, okay? And then we'll talk a little bit when we're done. So, thanks. Good lights.
I can only imagine what it will be like when I walk by your side. I can only imagine what my eyes will see when your face is before me. I can only imagine. I can only imagine. worship you. I can only imagine.
So, let the love of Christ for you motivate you in terms of how you respond to others, okay? So, I'm sure it's easy to be in a place like Yale where you're surrounded by a lot of really bright people, right? So you don't have very much exposure to people with intellectual disabilities, probably not a whole lot of folks with physical disabilities, but you'd be surprised. You have peers who suffer from mental illness. Some of you probably do, you know. Everybody's one heartbeat, one breath away from disability, one car accident, right? One birth of your child. Some of you will have kids with autism. You will. It's 1 out of 80 right now, 1 out of 50 boys. So, but it's not a death sentence, okay? It's life, right? It's a normal part of life in an abnormal world, and it's a life that's lived for God's glory just like any other. And often God uses for his glory even in greater ways. And I can testify that way through my son's life. It's changed my life dramatically, and it's been for the better. And so as far as professions and all, you know, I really believe that kingdom work can happen through any profession that is done in God-honoring work, right? You can be an accountant doing kingdom work. You can be a physical therapist doing kingdom work, right? And there are ways but there's all sorts of ways that you can positively impact the lives of people with disabilities. Some of you will own businesses someday. And I hope you intentionally hire some people with disabilities, because everybody needs the dignity of work. And some of you become, who was I talking to? It's going to become the cardiac pediatrician. There we go. So somebody like you saved my son's life, you know. Some of you become music therapists, or some of you will become world leaders that will impact the global effects of disability. Disability around the world is truly a crisis in many third world or developing countries, you know. So there are lots and lots of ways to think that God can use it, but you know, he can use it with your next door neighbors, right? He can use it in your local church too. So I'll be glad to field any questions, if there's anybody has any questions for me. Sorry, my slides got a little jumbled. This usually happens. People just want Kleenex. Yeah. And what I hope, disability aside, I hope is just you can take this picture with you of the gospel, right, into whatever you do. So, and that carries through in all your relationships. So, did you have a question, huh?
Where did you, what resources did you go to get such a, clear, great view of, what the postmodernist worldview is and what the modernist worldview is?
I actually there's a class, I took a bunch of seminary courses at Covenant Seminary in St. Louis. Hey, are you from St. Louis? Oh, pound it. So, I actually taught a seminary course on disability basically at Covenant, and it's online if you ever want to go. You just have nothing else to do with schoolwork and you want to listen to a seminary class. But anyway, I took a class there called Apologetics and Outreach for Contemporary Culture. If you ever, seriously, when you get out of school and you aren't doing classes anymore, Covenant Seminary has some great online classes, and you can take them for free. You know, so that's where, and just a lot of good, do a lot of good preaching, do a lot of reading. You know, I read a ton of books. Some of Francis Schaeffer's was helpful to me. I think what was really frustrating to me, I had to teach something at a conference one time on the image of God. So I thought, okay, I'll take the class, Man, Christ, and Redemption, which talks about the image of God. And when I read in the course, you're reading all these great historical Christian writers on the image of God, but because it was written during the Enlightenment, many of the pieces I was reading, all the focus was on reason. Like, some reading was going, okay, what did I say about Tim, right? So it really forced me to really think about, all right, how do you step back even and say, well, there's also things I can affirm in these writings, but I think they're incomplete, right? And so I did some work on the whole thing of the idea of the image of God, and just, is it really primarily a function of reason? And there's a great book. Oh no, I'm not going to be able to remember that. Oh, well, yeah, Ken, this is a sad little midlife thing. Okay, The Image of God is the name of the book, and it's fine. Not to get rid of the author, but it was an excellent book, because he talked about the whole idea that the image of God is often compared to the difference between humans and animals. And he said it really ought to be looked at, what is the difference between humans and Christ, right? Christ is the image of God, is what the New Testament teaches us. And so that totally changed my perspective on that as well. So, yeah. I think, too, the whole idea of respect-based relationships, that was another thing I spent a lot of time thinking through. It's like, and I think respect-based relationships are based on two pillars, grace and the image of God. If you try to just have a relationship with somebody based on the fact that they're an image bearer, and you run into their brokenness in 10 minutes, right? It's not very stable, right? But you try to only have a relationship with somebody on the basis of their brokenness, right, and not their value, right? You also won't get very far. And so I spend a lot of time going through these things, but doing a lot of reading, yeah. Any other questions? All right, well, equalconcern.org, if you ever need us, give us a call, okay? Thank you.